The small town of Maple Ridge, Kansas, sat nestled amidst endless fields of golden wheat and quiet, meandering highways. It was the kind of place where life moved slowly and everyone knew everyone else. This was home for 7-year-old Ethan Brooks and his mother, Sarah. Their little white house, modest and weathered, stood at the edge of town, a testament to their quiet determination and unyielding bond. Sarah Brooks was a single mother who worked long hours as a cashier at the local grocery store. Despite the challenges, she was a woman of unwavering strength and tenderness. Her laugh, soft and genuine, could light up a room, but behind it lay the weight of raising a child on her own in a town that wasn't always kind. Whispers about Sarah's circumstances floated through the air, subtle but sharp. People in Maple Ridge had their ways of judging without saying too much aloud. For Ethan, his mother was a superhero. Every morning, she packed his lunch with care, tucking a handwritten note into the bag, a small reminder of her love to carry him through the day. In Ethan's eyes, Sarah's tireless efforts made their house feel warm, no matter how tight money was or how much judgment they faced. But life outside the walls of their home wasn't as forgiving. Ethan, small and shy, often felt the weight of being different. Other children at school teased him, their words biting in ways they didn't fully understand. And then there was the school bus, a place that should have been safe but had become the source of his greatest anxiety. Each morning, Ethan climbed aboard the old yellow school bus with his small backpack slung over his shoulder and his head slightly bowed. The ride to school was supposed to be uneventful, but for Ethan, it was the most dreaded part of his day. At the helm of the bus sat Jim Carter, a grizzled 54-year-old man with a permanent scowl etched into his weathered face. His graying hair peeked out from under a frayed cap, and his uniform looked like it hadn't been properly laundered in weeks. Jim was a man set in his ways, harboring deep-seated frustrations that he unleashed on anyone he deemed weaker or different. In his eyes, Ethan was the perfect target, a quiet, vulnerable boy who wouldn't dare talk back. And worse yet, the son of Sarah Brooks, a single mother Jim openly disapproved of. To Jim, Sarah's circumstances were a mark of failure, and Ethan bore the brunt of that disdain. "Look at you," Jim sneered one morning as Ethan climbed aboard. His voice carried a rough edge that could cut through the hum of the bus engine. "A boy without a dad. No wonder you're so scrawny. You're never going to amount to anything." Ethan didn't reply. He never did. Instead, he kept his gaze fixed on the worn, rubber floor of the bus, gripping the straps of his backpack until his knuckles turned white. The jeers from other students, emboldened by Jim's remarks, echoed behind him. All Ethan wanted was to reach his seat unnoticed, to sit quietly and let the world pass him by. But silence was never enough for Jim. His taunts came regularly, biting at Ethan's confidence like a relentless wind. Yet Ethan endured it all in silence, hoping each day would somehow be better than the last. But one morning, everything changed. The routine cruelty that Ethan had grown to silently endure took a darker turn. A turn that would leave an indelible mark on his life and ripple across the small town of Maple Ridge, Kansas. It began as it always did, with Jim Carter's piercing glare locking onto Ethan as the boy stepped onto the bus. This time, though, the usual sneers and snide remarks weren't enough for Jim. He had a point to prove, a lesson to teach. And this time, his venom wasn't just directed at Ethan. It was aimed at someone far more precious to the boy, his mother. "Your mama must be real proud," Jim spat as Ethan cautiously found his seat. His voice dripped with disdain, loud enough for every child on the bus to hear. "Slaving away for scraps at that little store, barely keeping a roof over your heads. Bet she's just counting the days till someone else has to pick up her slack." Ethan froze, his breath catching in his throat. For a moment, the bus seemed to fall silent, the chatter of the other children evaporating as Jim's words hung heavy in the air. He felt a knot tighten in his chest, a wave of anger and hurt bubbling up in a way it never had before. This wasn't about him anymore. This was about the one person who worked tirelessly to make sure he felt safe, loved, and cared for. The person he admired most in the world. That day, Ethan didn't look down. He didn't keep quiet. His small hands clenched the straps of his backpack, and his voice, trembling but determined, broke the silence. "Don't talk about my mom like that," he said, his voice quivering but louder than he'd ever spoken to Jim before. You don't know anything about her." It was a moment of courage that should have inspired respect, but for Jim Carter, it was an unforgivable challenge. And what he did next would change Ethan's life, and the town, forever. It was a morning like any other, the kind of day that Ethan Brooks had come to dread. He approached the bus with his small backpack slung over his shoulder, the strap slightly frayed from use. The sound of the engine idling was a low rumble that filled the quiet air, and the metal door groaned open as he stepped aboard. Ethan kept his eyes downcast, his small frame almost curling in on itself as if to make himself invisible. "Good morning," he mumbled softly, a polite habit drilled into him by his mother, Sarah. But politeness held no sway over Jim Carter. "Well, if it isn't the little charity case," Jim sneered, his gravelly voice loud enough to carry to the back of the bus. His expression twisted into a mocking smirk. "Back for another free ride, huh? You're lucky this bus doesn't charge for freeloaders." Ethan winced, clutching the straps of his backpack tighter. He tried to brush past quickly, desperate to make it to his usual seat in the middle of the bus. But Jim wasn't done. "You hear that, kids?" Jim said, addressing the rest of the passengers. "This one here doesn't even have a dad. Just him and that hardworking mom of his. Hardworking at what, I wonder?" His words drew scattered giggles from some of the students, while others shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Ethan's gaze. Ethan felt his cheeks flush as the words stung like nettles. He wanted to disappear, to sink into the cracked vinyl seat and never be seen again. His vision blurred as tears began to well up, but he fought them back. Crying only made it worse. Jim, sensing no resistance, pressed further. "You know what I bet? I bet his mom's sitting at home right now, waiting for her next government check. Maybe she should have thought twice before raising a kid on her own, huh?" The laughter behind him grew louder, mingling with murmurs and whispers. Ethan could feel the heat rise in his chest, his breaths quickening. He gritted his teeth, staring at the floor. His mom wasn't like that. She worked hard, so hard, to make sure he had everything he needed. She was his hero. But how could he explain that to someone like Jim? The knot of humiliation, anger, and sadness in his chest swelled to an unbearable size. For the first time, Ethan felt something shift inside him. He wasn't sure what it was, but he knew he couldn't stay silent forever. Something had to change, and soon it would. The bus rattled along the bumpy road, and Jim Carter's voice cut through the chatter like a blade. He wasn't finished. His mocking tone grew sharper as he zeroed in on Ethan's most vulnerable point, his mother. "Your mom," Jim began, his voice dripping with disdain. "She's probably sitting at home right now, waiting for her welfare check. Maybe flipping through the classifieds, looking for some poor guy to take pity on her." The students chuckled nervously, their laughter an awkward echo that filled the tight space. Ethan froze in his seat, his hands trembling as they gripped his backpack straps. The words were worse than anything Jim had said before. His mother, the woman who stayed up late folding clothes, who always found time to smile no matter how tired she was, didn't deserve this. Ethan's heart raced, and the familiar sting of tears began to blur his vision. Jim, emboldened by Ethan's silence, sneered. "Single moms like her, they can't even take care of their own kids properly. Maybe she should have given you up to someone who could actually handle the job." That was it. Ethan's chest tightened as the knot of emotion he'd been holding in finally burst. His small hands trembled as he rose to his feet, legs shaky but steadying beneath him. For the first time, Ethan found his voice. "Don't talk about my mom like that," he shouted, his voice quivering but loud enough to echo through the bus. His wide, tear-filled eyes locked on Jim. "She works harder than anyone you'll ever know. You don't know anything about her." A stunned silence fell over the bus. The other students stopped laughing, some even turning away, their faces flushed with discomfort. But Jim's face darkened, his smirk replaced by a look of anger. To him, this wasn't courage, it was defiance. "Sit down, boy," Jim growled, his voice low and menacing. "You don't get to talk to me like that." But Ethan didn't move, his small frame radiating a courage he hadn't known he possessed. The bus jerked to a sudden stop, the screech of the brakes cutting through the tense silence like a scream. The students lurched forward in their seats, startled by the abrupt halt. Outside, the road stretched endlessly in both directions, flanked by open fields and dense patches of trees. There wasn't a house or car in sight. Jim's heavy hand gripped the lever, and the door hissed open. His face was a mask of fury, his voice thunderous as he turned to face Ethan. "If you can't learn to shut your mouth and respect your elders," he snarled, "then you can get off this bus and walk the rest of the way to school." Ethan's small frame trembled, but he didn't reply. He didn't have the chance. Jim stomped down the narrow aisle, his boots thudding against the metal floor, and stopped right in front of Ethan's seat. With a rough hand, he yanked the boy to his feet. Ethan winced but didn't resist, his hands still clutching the straps of his backpack. "Out!" Jim barked, dragging Ethan to the open door. The other students sat frozen in shock, their wide eyes darting between Jim and Ethan. No one dared to speak. No one dared to move. Jim shoved Ethan forward, the boy's feet stumbling over the metal step as he landed on the dusty shoulder of the road. The midday sun beat down mercilessly, and the heat radiated off the asphalt in shimmering waves. Ethan turned back to look at the bus, his wide eyes meeting Jim's glare for one fleeting moment. Then, with a slam of the door and a roar of the engine, the bus pulled away. Ethan stood there, alone, as the yellow vehicle disappeared down the road, leaving nothing behind but a cloud of dust and the faint echoes of its retreating tires. For a moment, he didn't move. His heart pounded in his chest, and his mind raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The empty road stretched out before him, endless and unkind. Ethan, just 7 years old, was now completely alone. Ethan stood frozen at the side of the road, his legs trembling beneath him. The midday sun blazed mercilessly overhead, turning the asphalt beneath his feet into a scorching surface that seemed to radiate heat in waves. Around him, the countryside stretched out in every direction, vast, empty fields and dense clusters of trees. Not a single car passed by. Not a single soul was in sight. His chest heaved as he tried to calm his shallow breaths, but panic had already taken root in his mind. He clutched the straps of his backpack tightly, the familiar weight of it suddenly feeling heavier than ever. His eyes darted up and down the road, searching for something, anything that might guide him. But all he saw was the same unbroken ribbon of highway stretching into the horizon. A tear slipped down his cheek and then another, until they came in a steady stream. Ethan wiped at his face with his sleeve, but it was no use. The fear, the humiliation, and the overwhelming sense of abandonment felt too big for his small body to contain. He thought of the bus driving away, the cruel satisfaction on Jim's face, the silence of his classmates. His heart ached, but it was the image of his mother, her kind smile, her gentle hands, that hurt the most. How could he tell her what had happened? How could he face her after this? As his sobs began to slow, a faint memory stirred in his mind. His mother's voice, steady and soothing, from a conversation long ago. "If you ever get lost or find yourself in trouble, Ethan, stay on the main road. Follow it until you find somewhere safe. And remember, no matter what, I'm always with you." He sniffled, wiping his nose on his sleeve, and looked down at the endless stretch of highway. He didn't know where it would lead, but it was all he had. Gathering what little courage he could muster, Ethan adjusted the straps of his backpack and took a hesitant step forward, then another. The dusty road crunched beneath his worn sneakers as he began to walk. The heat was unrelenting, and every step felt heavier than the last. His small shadow trailed behind him, the only companion on this lonely stretch of road. The tears kept coming, but Ethan didn't stop. With each step, he whispered softly to himself, "Just keep going. Mom would want me to keep going." The highway stretched out before Ethan, a seemingly endless line of cracked asphalt shimmering under the scorching sun. He kept walking, his small sneakers scuffing against the hot surface. His legs ached with every step, the heat pressing down on him like an invisible weight. The sun was relentless, beating on his back and making his skin feel like it might catch fire. Sweat dripped down his forehead and into his eyes, stinging as he blinked it away. His throat was dry, so dry it felt like sandpaper, and every swallow sent a sharp pang through his parched mouth. He hadn't had a sip of water since breakfast, and now the lack of it gnawed at him. Ethan wiped his face with the sleeve of his shirt, but it was already soaked through. His pace slowed as the exhaustion set in. Each step felt like a monumental effort, but he refused to stop. The memory of his mother's encouraging words echoed in his mind. You're stronger than you think, Ethan. Don't give up, no matter how hard things seem. He clung to that thought, using it to push past the overwhelming fatigue and fear. Suddenly, the low rumble of an engine broke through the stillness. Ethan froze, his heart leaping at the sound of hope. A large truck appeared on the horizon, its bright red paint dulled by dust. As it drew closer, Ethan raised his arm, waving frantically, his small hand trembling with desperation. His dry lips cracked as he tried to call out, but his voice came out as a hoarse croak. The truck thundered past him, stirring up a cloud of dust and gravel. Ethan stumbled back, coughing as the grit stung his throat and filled his lungs. He squinted through the haze, watching the truck disappear down the road without even slowing. For a moment, he stood there, motionless. His heart sank, and the loneliness felt sharper than ever. He wanted to cry again, to scream out his frustration at the unfairness of it all. But he didn't. He couldn't. Instead, he wiped the back of his hand across his face, brushing away the tears that threatened to fall, and forced his feet to move. The road ahead didn't change. It was the same monotonous expanse of gray stretching endlessly between fields of tall grass and clusters of trees. Each step sent a dull ache through his legs, and his backpack felt heavier with every mile. His arms ached from carrying it, but he clung to the straps as if they were the only thing tethering him to the world. Ethan's mind drifted as he walked, trying to distract himself from the heat and the pain. He thought of his mother, picturing her standing in their tiny kitchen, making his favorite peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. He remembered her singing softly to herself as she folded laundry late into the night, her voice calming and warm. She had always been there for him, always made him feel safe, no matter how hard things got. Mom wouldn't give up, he told himself, his voice barely above a whisper. She wouldn't let something like this stop her. The thought gave him strength, even as his body begged him to rest. He knew he couldn't stop. Stopping would mean giving in, and giving in wasn't an option. So Ethan kept walking, step after step, with the image of his mother's encouraging smile lighting the way forward. The sun began to dip lower in the sky, its golden rays casting long shadows across the road. But the heat hadn't let up, and Ethan's head throbbed with the strain of it. He adjusted his backpack, the straps digging into his small shoulders, and kept moving. The promise of safety, however distant, was enough to keep his tired legs from buckling. As he walked, a soft breeze rustled the tall grass on either side of the road, carrying with it the faint scent of earth and wildflowers. For a brief moment, Ethan felt a sliver of calm. He closed his eyes, letting the breeze cool his flushed face. The road was long, and the challenges were many, but he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The phone rang sharply on the counter, jolting Sarah Brooks from her work at the kitchen table. She picked it up, brushing a strand of hair from her face, her hands already feeling clammy from an unexplainable unease. "Mrs. Brooks," came the voice on the other end, belonging to Ethan's teacher. "We were just checking in. Ethan didn't arrive at school today. Is everything all right?" Sarah's heart stopped. The pen she was holding fell to the floor, forgotten. "What do you mean he didn't get to school? He got on the bus this morning." Her voice trembled, fear clawing at her chest. "I'm not sure," the teacher replied carefully. "Perhaps there's been a mix-up, but we thought you should know." Sarah didn't wait to hear more. She hung up, grabbed her phone, and called the police, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely press the buttons. "My son," she choked out when the dispatcher answered. "He didn't make it to school. He's just 7 years old. Please, you have to help me." The dispatcher's voice was calm, professional. "We'll send officers out immediately, ma'am. Can you tell us his last known location?" Sarah explained that Ethan had boarded the school bus that morning. Within minutes, patrol cars began scouring the area. Word spread quickly through their small town, and neighbors joined in, driving along the empty highways and through back roads, calling Ethan's name. Sarah, now in her car, drove along the bus route herself, her hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. Hours passed. The sun hung lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the land. Just as Sarah's desperation threatened to overwhelm her, a call came over the police radio. "We found him," an officer said. "He's on Highway 46, about 5 miles out of town. He's alive." Sarah pulled over, her breath catching in her throat. She turned the car around and sped toward the location, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. When she arrived, she saw the flashing lights of a patrol car and, standing beside it, a tiny, dust-covered figure. "Ethan!" she cried, jumping out of the car. Her legs felt like jelly as she ran toward him, and when she reached him, she dropped to her knees and pulled him into her arms. His small body trembled, and she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "Mama," Ethan whispered, his voice hoarse and weak. "I tried to keep walking." Sarah held him tighter, tears streaming down her face. "I'm here, Ethan," she murmured. "You're safe now. I've got you. I'll always have you." The officers stood nearby, their expressions softening at the sight of the mother and son reunited. One handed Sarah a bottle of water, which she held to Ethan's cracked lips. He drank in small, careful sips, his tired eyes meeting hers. As Sarah carried him to her car, she glanced back at the officers. "Thank you," she said, her voice breaking. They nodded in understanding. On the way home, Sarah couldn't stop glancing at Ethan in the rearview mirror, his eyelids fluttering as exhaustion finally took hold. The relief of having him back was overwhelming, but so was the anger bubbling beneath it. Someone had put her child in harm's way, and she was determined to find out who and make them pay. Back at home, Ethan sat on the couch, wrapped in a blanket despite the lingering warmth of the day. A half-empty glass of water rested in his trembling hands, and Sarah knelt in front of him, her eyes filled with worry and anger. "Ethan," she said gently, "I need you to tell me everything that happened." Ethan hesitated, his small fingers gripping the glass tightly. "It was Jim," he finally whispered, his voice cracking. "The bus driver." Sarah's heart sank. "What about Jim, sweetheart?" He got mad at me," Ethan said, tears welling in his eyes. "I told him not to talk about you like that, but he got really mad. He stopped the bus, and he made me get off." His voice broke, and he buried his face in his hands. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "He made you get off the bus? Ethan, where? Where did he leave you?" "On the road," Ethan murmured. "There was nothing there, just trees and grass. He said I had to walk if I couldn't be quiet." Sarah's chest tightened with a mix of fury and heartbreak. She pulled Ethan into her arms, holding him close as his small body shook with quiet sobs. "It's not your fault, Ethan," she whispered fiercely. "You didn't do anything wrong. None of this is your fault." When the police arrived, Sarah helped Ethan recount the story again. He described the taunts, the cruel remarks, and how Jim had shoved him off the bus. The officers listened intently, their expressions growing darker with each detail. As the news spread, it ignited a firestorm in the small town. Parents who had long trusted the school system to keep their children safe were outraged. Neighbors exchanged heated words at grocery stores, on porches, and over social media. How could this happen, they asked. How could a grown man be so cruel to a child? In the days that followed, more stories began to surface. Parents reached out to Sarah, their voices trembling with anger and guilt. "My son told me Jim made fun of his shoes last week," one mother confessed. "He said they were too cheap." "My daughter told me Jim called her lazy because she fell asleep on the bus," another parent said. "I didn't think much of it at the time, but now." The most damning testimonies came from Ethan's classmates. Several of them bravely admitted that they, too, had been targets of Jim's verbal abuse. One boy said Jim had called him stupid for dropping his lunchbox. A girl recalled how Jim mocked her for her weight in front of everyone. It became painfully clear that Jim's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. He had been bullying children for years, using his authority as a bus driver to humiliate and belittle them. But Ethan's story, his courage to stand up for his mother and endure Jim's retaliation, was the spark that finally brought it all to light. As the evidence mounted, Sarah felt the weight of the town's collective anger pressing down on her, but beneath that anger was something more powerful: resolve. This time, there would be accountability. This time, things would change. The investigation into Jim Carter's actions moved swiftly. The police, armed with the accounts of Ethan, his classmates, and their parents, conducted interviews and reviewed the history of complaints lodged against him. What they uncovered was more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. Jim Carter, who had been employed as a school bus driver for over 15 years, had a long track record of complaints. Parents had reported his rude behavior and condescending remarks, but the complaints were often brushed aside or labeled as misunderstandings. "Jim's just rough around the edges," one former administrator had said dismissively. But now, those words felt like a glaring failure. Sarah's determination was unshakable. She met with school administrators demanding answers. How many children were ignored? How many families felt powerless against this man? She asked, her voice steady but charged with emotion. The administrators, visibly uncomfortable, admitted that their oversight had allowed Jim's behavior to go unchecked. The testimonies from Ethan's classmates added fuel to the investigation. Several children described a pattern of verbal abuse and humiliation that spanned years. Jim had called one boy worthless, mocked another girl's appearance, and routinely made disparaging remarks about children from lower-income families. These were not isolated incidents. They painted a picture of a man who had abused his position of power to belittle and intimidate those who couldn't fight back. The breaking point was Ethan's ordeal. Forcing a 7-year-old child off a bus on a deserted highway wasn't just cruel, it was criminal. The police charged Jim with multiple counts, including child endangerment and abuse. His actions violated both state laws and the ethical standards expected of school employees. As the charges were announced, the community's outrage reached a boiling point. The school district acted swiftly to distance itself from Jim. He was terminated immediately, his employment record permanently marked with his misconduct. His driver's license was revoked, ensuring he would never again hold a position of trust involving children. But for Sarah and the other parents, firing Jim wasn't enough. They wanted justice and change. When Jim appeared in court, his once defiant demeanor had faded into a grim resignation. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The judge, noting the severity of Jim's actions and his history of misconduct, handed down a sentence that reflected the community's anger. Jim was convicted on charges of child endangerment and child abuse, receiving a prison sentence that would prevent him from ever harming another child. Outside the courtroom, Sarah stood with Ethan by her side, her hand resting protectively on his shoulder. Reporters surrounded them, cameras flashing and microphones held aloft. Sarah's voice was steady as she spoke. "This isn't just about Ethan. This is about ensuring no child has to endure what he went through. It's about holding people accountable and demanding better from those we trust with our children's safety." As Jim was escorted away in handcuffs, it was clear that his actions had irrevocably changed the community. But through their pain and outrage, the people of Maple Ridge found a shared purpose: to ensure that the lessons of this incident would lead to lasting change for their children and for generations to come. The courtroom was packed. Rows of parents, community members, and even a few teachers sat in tense silence as the trial of Jim Carter unfolded. Ethan, too young to testify directly in court, had already given his statement to the investigators, and Sarah sat beside him in the front row, her hand resting protectively on his knee. The weight of the past weeks was etched onto her face, but her resolve was unshakable. Jim sat at the defense table, his once defiant demeanor replaced by a subdued, almost defeated posture. His lawyer shuffled through papers, attempting to craft a defense that could mitigate the overwhelming evidence against him. But the truth was undeniable, and everyone in the room knew it. The prosecution laid out its case methodically. Witnesses described Jim's years of bullying and intimidation, recounting incidents of verbal abuse and outright humiliation that had left countless children in tears. Parents testified about the lasting impact his words had on their kids, how their self-confidence had been eroded by his cruel taunts. Ethan's story was the centerpiece, its raw emotion underscoring the severity of Jim's actions. "He shoved a 7-year-old child off a bus in the middle of nowhere," the prosecutor declared, her voice firm. "Not only did he endanger this boy's life, but he also betrayed the trust of every family who entrusted him with their children. Jim Carter didn't just cross a line, he obliterated it." Jim's defense attorney tried to argue that his client had been under stress, that he hadn't intended to harm Ethan. "My client has served this community for over 15 years, the lawyer said. This was a momentary lapse in judgment. But the judge, an imposing woman with sharp eyes, was unmoved. A lapse in judgment, she repeated, her voice cutting through the courtroom. This man had a documented history of mistreating children. His actions weren't an accident, they were a pattern. The final blow came when Ethan's statement was read aloud. Though delivered in the hesitant, simple words of a child, it carried a weight that no one could ignore. He said mean things about my mom, Ethan's statement read. I told him to stop, but he got mad. He made me get off the bus, and I was scared. I didn't know where I was, and I thought no one would find me. A hush fell over the courtroom. Many parents wiped away tears, their anger and sorrow written plainly on their faces. Jim's expression hardened, but he didn't look up. When the judge delivered her verdict, her tone was resolute. Jim Carter, your actions were not only reckless but deliberate. You endangered a vulnerable child and betrayed your responsibility to the community. This court finds you guilty on all charges. Jim was sentenced to 5 years in prison, the maximum penalty for his offenses. He would also be barred from working with children in any capacity for the rest of his life. As the gavel fell, a murmur swept through the room. Relief mingled with anger and sadness. For many, the sentence wasn't just about punishing Jim. It was about sending a message that such behavior would never be tolerated again. Outside the courthouse, Sarah stood with Ethan as reporters swarmed around them. Cameras flashed and microphones were thrust toward her. She held her son close, her voice calm but firm as she addressed the crowd. This verdict isn't just justice for Ethan, it's justice for every child who's ever felt powerless. It's a reminder that we must hold people accountable, especially when the safety of our children is at stake. Jim's conviction rippled through Maple Ridge. His name was plastered across local news, his face a constant reminder of the community's failure to act sooner. Neighbors who had once defended him now turned their backs. His family distanced themselves, unwilling to share in the fallout of his disgrace. For Jim, prison was only part of the punishment. His social exile was absolute. The town that had once tolerated him now condemned him, and there was no place left for him to hide. For Ethan and Sarah, the trial's conclusion marked the beginning of healing. While justice had been served, the scars of Jim's actions would take time to fade. But in the eyes of the community, Ethan had become a symbol of resilience, a reminder that even the smallest voices can lead to the loudest changes. The court's verdict against Jim Carter brought some closure to Sarah and Ethan, but Sarah knew the fight wasn't over. Justice for her son was only part of the solution. The larger issue, the system that allowed someone like Jim to remain in a position of power for so long, still needed to be addressed. In the weeks following the trial, Sarah began mobilizing the community. She started with the other parents who had spoken out during the investigation, their anger and frustration still fresh. We need to make sure this never happens again, Sarah said during a meeting at the local community center. Our children deserve better. Her first proposal was straightforward but impactful, installing surveillance cameras on all school buses. These cameras would not only ensure that any inappropriate behavior could be documented, but also serve as a deterrent against potential misconduct. If someone knows they're being watched, they'll think twice before doing something wrong, Sarah argued. The parents rallied behind her, and soon the proposal was brought before the school board. At first, there was resistance. Some board members cited budget concerns, while others worried about privacy issues. But Sarah, armed with the overwhelming public support and her own heartbreaking experience, countered every objection with unwavering determination. The safety of our children isn't negotiable, she said during a heated meeting. If we can afford to buy new sports equipment or update our facilities, we can afford to protect the kids who rely on us to get to school safely. Her second initiative focused on ethics training for bus drivers. Sarah believed that the problem wasn't just one individual, but a lack of accountability and proper guidance across the system. She proposed mandatory workshops on professionalism, child psychology, and diversity awareness, ensuring that every driver understood their responsibilities not only as employees, but as protectors of the children they transported. These reforms, once seen as ambitious, began gaining traction as Sarah's story and Ethan's ordeal continued to resonate across the community. Local media picked up the story, amplifying her message and drawing attention from neighboring districts. We need a system that prioritizes our kids, not just convenience, Sarah said in a televised interview. If it takes more effort, so be it. They're worth it. The momentum didn't stop at Maple Ridge. State representatives took notice, and Sarah was invited to speak at a legislative hearing on school safety reforms. With calm conviction, she shared Ethan's story and outlined her vision for a safer, more accountable transportation system. Her testimony was met with applause, and soon after, legislation was passed requiring all school buses in the state to be equipped with cameras and for all drivers to complete ethics training. For Sarah, the reforms were more than just policies. They were a promise to every parent and child that what happened to Ethan would never happen again. As she watched the first bus in Maple Ridge roll out with its new cameras installed, she felt a sense of accomplishment. The road to change had been long and hard, but she had made it. And in doing so, she had turned her family's pain into a beacon of hope for others. Life in Maple Ridge gradually settled back into a quiet rhythm, but for Sarah and Ethan, everything felt different. The echoes of the ordeal lingered, but with each passing day, they found themselves rediscovering moments of peace and joy. The sharp edges of fear and anger began to dull, replaced by a sense of resilience and pride. Ethan returned to school with a renewed spirit. While the memory of that day on the highway hadn't faded, it no longer consumed him. His classmates treated him with a newfound respect, seeing him not as the quiet boy who sat in the middle of the bus, but as someone who had stood up against injustice. Some even came up to him in the cafeteria or on the playground, saying things like, "You're really brave, Ethan," or "Thanks for speaking up about Jim." The bus rides, now under the watchful eye of the newly installed cameras and kinder, better-trained drivers, no longer filled Ethan with dread. He sat near the window, gazing out at the passing fields with a calmness he hadn't felt in a long time. The bus had become just a bus again, a way to get to school, nothing more. For Sarah, life also began to find its balance. Her job at the grocery store continued, but she was no longer just another face behind the counter. Customers greeted her with admiration and gratitude. "You're an inspiration," they often said. "What you've done for the community will make a difference for years to come." Her advocacy work didn't end with the reforms. Sarah joined local committees focused on school safety and continued to speak at community events, her voice becoming a beacon for parents who wanted better for their children. Through her efforts, Sarah discovered a strength within herself that she hadn't known existed, a strength she passed on to Ethan. One warm evening, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Sarah and Ethan sat together on the front porch. The air was still, carrying the faint scent of blooming wildflowers. Ethan held a glass of lemonade in his hands, swinging his legs absent-mindedly as he stared at the colorful sky. Sarah glanced at her son, a soft smile playing on her lips. "You know, Ethan," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "I couldn't be prouder of you." Ethan looked up at her, his eyes curious. "Why, Mom?" "Because you didn't let fear stop you," Sarah replied. "You stood up for yourself and for what's right, even when it was hard. That takes real courage." Ethan's cheeks flushed slightly, and he looked back out at the horizon. "I just didn't want him to talk about you like that." Sarah's heart swelled with love. She reached over, brushing a strand of hair from his forehead. "And you made sure he couldn't. Because of you, things are better, for all the kids in this town." They sat quietly for a while, watching as the first stars began to twinkle in the deepening sky. Finally, Sarah spoke again, her voice soft but filled with conviction. "We did it, Ethan," she said. "Everything's better now." Ethan turned to her, his lips curling into a small but genuine smile. "Yeah, Mom," he said. "We did." And as the sun disappeared completely, leaving the world bathed in a gentle twilight, mother and son sat side by side, content in the knowledge that their journey, though difficult, had made a lasting difference. This story reminds us of the power of resilience, courage, and the fight for justice. If you believe in creating a safer and kinder world for every child, don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories that inspire change. Together, we can raise awareness and make a difference. What part of this story impacted you the most? Let us know in the comments below.